Hello, everyone. We are here today with Clyde Guzmán. He will be telling us his conversion story from Adventism to Catholicism. So, how you doing, Clyde?
I'm good, Ezekiel. Thank you so much for the invitation.
Thank you for coming.
Yeah,
So, why don't you introduce yourself a bit?
sure. As you mentioned, my name is Clyde Guzmán. For those who recognize me, I appeared in various other YouTube channels, and most recently with Dom from the Logos Project, which he and I were talking about Catholicism and social media. But for those who know me through social media outside of YouTube, would know that I run various big Catholic social media platforms on various um, different means, primarily through Instagram. My main Instagram that most of you pretty much know me from is Latin Catholicism, which is a page, which is one of many social media pages that I use to dedicate to defending the Catholic faith. I don't consider myself influencer because I really do not like the phrase influencer. It kind of is like a cringe title, but I just use social media as just another way of evangelizing the Catholic faith.
Awesome. Thanks. So, to begin with, maybe it would be good to know something about the what Adventism is.
Sure. Anything in particular you want to know about, like the brief history, how long it's been around, or you just want to give me just straight into just a summarized version of it?
Yeah, just as a summarized version and
Okay.
how you got there.
Okay. So, a brief history of the Seventh day Adventist Church. The Seventh day Adventist Church was an offshoot from a big movement that took place in the United States of America called the Second Great Awakening, which is obviously from an offshoot from the First Great Awakening that it took place in the United States of America. And for those of you who do not know what the Great Awakening was, it was kind of like this big evangelistic Christian revival in America, in which which sprung hundreds of thousands of people through all over the United States to have like this strong um, devotion to Scripture, love of God, all that stuff. And within those two Great Awakenings arose various other denominations. However, the Second Great Awakening um, was more impactful because that was when one person named William Miller, who was not a Seventh Day Adventist, but during that time, he was reading the Book of Revelation, and especially the Book of Daniel, and he prophesied that the second coming of Jesus Christ would take place in the year 1844. Now, as you and I both know, no one knows the year or the time where Jesus Christ is going to return to earth. We know that, but remember now, during the time during the Great Awakening, there was a huge spiritual revival, quote unquote. So a lot of emotion, a lot of sympathy towards this idea and stuff. And there were many individuals before William Miller that were predicting the end of the world, but William Miller's prediction was more impactful because he was one of the people responsible for the Second Great Awakening, and he amassed hundreds of thousands of followers um, because of his prophecies and everything, and almost everyone believed him. But by the time, I can't remember what specific date because it's been so long since I left Adventism, but it was around 1844 that they were waiting for Christ to happen on that specific date, but nothing happened at all, and left so many people disappointed, and then they just left him. However, obviously, a few people remained, but William Miller and other people thought that 1844 was not the year that Jesus Christ was supposed to come, but it was the actual time in which Jesus Christ left the holiest place to the most holiest of places. And that's like a whole different subject. So, to me, looking back at it now, I'm not. I do believe that William Miller and other people were probably just trying to um, defend a reputation, considering the fact that he led more than 100,000 people to believe in his prophesied prediction about the second coming of Jesus Christ after such a long time. But fast forward many years later, came a woman who was a follower of William Miller named Ellen White. And Ellen White, who various other people are familiar, is considered to be the founder of the Seventh-day Adventist Church, along with her husband, James White, not to be confused with the notorious James White that has been around the internet and has been around the Protestant circles for many decades now. But um, Ellen White is considered to be the prophetess of the Seventh-day Adventist Church as well as its founder. And the reason why I say prophetess, because she received visions, quote unquote visions from God, about various different things. And obviously those visions are related to many of the beliefs of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. Um, After quite some time, the Adventist Church, through her work, along with the works of various other prominent Adventists, over the years, the Adventist Church began to grow tremendously. And by the early 20th century, like the early 1900s, it was now considered to be an official denomination. The Adventist Church has been compared to the Catholic Church in terms of the works that we do. When it comes to, the hospital system and everything, that the Catholic Church is ranked #1 in the world. But when it comes to missionary work, healthcare, all that stuff, the Adventist Church is technically ranked #2 and is the one of the fastest growing Protestant denominations in the world. And you can even argue that when it comes to the evangelical world, it's ranked #1 in terms of those specific areas that I just mentioned. Um, One of the most common beliefs that you may have seen or heard from Seventh-day Adventism is that we, not considering me now because I'm not an Adventist anymore, but it's not prior, but one of the beliefs of the Seventh-day Adventists is that they do not worship on Sunday, but they hold on to the Jewish Sabbath, which is on Saturday. So they interpret the Ten Commandments. They do not believe, the Adventist Church does not believe that the old Sabbath, which was on Saturday, was transferred over to Sunday, which is the new Sabbath. We don't call it Sabbath just in order to avoid the confusion. But another common belief that the Adventist Church is well known for is I want to say it in a more compassionate but also worry way, is the kind of like an obsessive nature, if you would, of the second coming of Jesus Christ, in which they believe that that as we Catholics, we do believe in the second coming of Jesus Christ, but unlike us, they believe that his coming is more imminent, as in it could happen any moment and stuff. But if you ever want to learn more about the history of the Adventist Church in more detail, as well as more in depth about the core doctrines of the Adventist Church, you're more than happy to go on the internet. It's completely free. But other than that, the denomination, as I mentioned, is one of the fastest growing Protestant denominations in the world. And if I'm not mistaken, I cannot remember the amount, but I know it is in the tens of millions. By the time I was still an Adventist, probably now the number is still growing. But surprisingly, the number of people that do leave the Adventist Church to different denominations or Eastern Orthodoxy or Catholicism is still a minority, but it's still a small growing minority.
Okay. And how did you become Adventist?
I was born and raised a Seventh-day Adventist from two loving parents who were not born and raised Seventh-day Adventists themselves. My mother, um, my mother, and both of my family were nominal Catholics, if you would. Um, my on my father's side, my father was not raised Catholic, but his mother and so on and so forth were raised Catholic, but they were culturally Catholic. They were ignorant about the faith. But sometime later, my paternal grandmother, my father's mother, sometime left the Catholic Church. I think she became a Pentecostal, and then it wasn't until much later on she discovered the Adventist Church. And then after some time, my father was introduced to the Adventist Church and the Adventism as a whole, um, by his mother as well as various other people. My mother, on her side, obviously cultural Catholics, if you would. My mother was not born an Adventist; she was actually raised a Catholic, quote unquote, devout, if you could say. But later on, over time, she left Catholicism, obviously due to doctrinal ignorance, and became a Pentecostal for some time. And then, sometime in her I think late teens, early 20s, the whole family, a portion of the family became Adventists. And then many years later, both my parents met, and then they had me, and then my two other siblings, who were all, including myself, were born and raised in the Seventh-day Adventist Church.
Okay, how was that experience being raised in an Adventist manner, I
Uh,
guess?
Overall, I am very grateful and thankful for my parents to giving me the education and the understanding of who Jesus Christ is. I will obviously give credit where credit is due, because I argue that if it wasn't for my Protestant background, I would not have, understood a lot of the things that I know today, especially with regards to scripture and doctrine. However, my experience was different because at a very young age, um, I was actually very interested in Catholicism, which is actually something really rare that you see in Protestants, young Protestants who are not anti-Catholic growing up. Most people will know that the Adventist Church is a very anti-Catholic denomination. I mean, it still holds on to very strong anti-Catholic principles and ideals from the 1800s, which is nothing new. I mean, a lot of denominations do, but the Adventist Church is very particular at that, which I'll get into later. But I was very curious to Catholicism because of all the things I've heard and all the interactions that I've seen, only briefly. And over the years, it made me very interested in actually studying and learning about Catholicism, even though I did receive a lot of negativity and backlash because of that. Nevertheless, I felt drawn towards Catholicism little by little, and I argue that it's God's grace that was actually leading me to His church.
You went to a school of Adventists or something?
Yes, I, I was going to get into that. So most of my life, I actually went to public school. Um, my parents moved around all over in the United States, but many people will not don't know is that in various pockets of the United States, just like there are little like Adventist towns, if you would, quote unquote, but not really. But we call them Adventist towns because historically that was when the Seventh Day Adventist Church was more active and it has like a more population because the Adventists have been around that particular area in that specific sector of the United States for like a particular period of time. Um, my I was born and raised in Tacoma Park, Maryland, which is a hub, if you would, of Adventist, because not only a couple blocks away from where I was living at the time years ago was an Adventist university, and there are many different Adventist churches in Tacoma Park, Maryland, as well as various other places in the United States. But Tacoma Park, Maryland, is another historical site for the Adventist Church, and like I mentioned, it was like another pocket location for the Adventist population. So my parents lived there at the time, and my sister, who is now 20 years old, she was born at the hospital that was right across from that Adventist university, which was convenient at the time, which is only just walk a few blocks just to get born in the hospital. We didn't stay in Tacoma Park, Maryland for that long. We decided to move to Silver Spring. And then that was when my youngest sister, she was not born in an Adventist hospital, but she was actually born in the Holy Cross Hospital, which is a Catholic hospital, which was very interesting. Looking back at it now, I think I recall seeing a few priests walking by Holy Cross Hospital, but it's been a very long time that since my youngest sister was born. And after some time, we stayed in Silver Spring, Maryland. We decided to move to Virginia, which we have been staying there for almost 15, 16 years at this point. And that's where we have been staying up until now, since I myself personally and my family decided to be moving to Florida for retirement.
Okay. And at which age did you begin to, think deeper about the faith and get more in touch with Catholicism?
That is a trick question, considering that I can't really pinpoint where, but I would argue from one of my earliest memories, if I can remember, was the funeral of John Paul II. Again, this was one of my earliest memories that I can remember. I remember only briefly, like all over newspapers, articles, TV, that people were talking about him. I didn't know who he was. I just kind of knew he was like a famous person at the time. And like I mentioned, the funeral of John Paul II was headline international. And even in like stores and even grocery stores, if you ever went to like a Giant or a Shoppers or any kind of grocery store, if you go like in the section where they have like candles, you will see, there's a lot of like Catholic candles. And one of the images obviously was John Paul II. So I kind of briefly remember that of John Paul II. My other small brief interactions of Catholicism would have to be, imagery that I've seen by accident through television, if I was watching a movie or a show of my family or my sisters, and even cartoons where they kind of like have little like religious symbolisms and stuff. They always like put like a statue of the Virgin Mary or a painting of Jesus or stuff, like a Catholic church for that matter. So those are like little hints. But I would argue that around the time of late elementary school, early middle school was when I slowly started to study a little bit about Catholicism, because I noticed I was different from my peers at school, because through my ignorance, I was asking them who goes to church on Saturday. No one raised their hand. I remember this. I think I was in 5th or 6th grade. And then I said, who goes to church on Sunday? And my whole group rose their hand. And I was so confused. I was like, when you're young, you don't think about the outside world that much. And you're really ignorant of a lot of things that happen to you in your life. But I think it was that moment, and as well as other moments, that really made me figure out like what made me different from the other denominations or what other people who call themselves Christians at the time. Fast forward to late middle school, I started to study a bit more about Catholicism through reading and getting to know various Catholic authors. historical authors like Thomas of Aquinas, St. Augustine, as well as learning about various Catholic converts such as Scott Hahn and various people from the 70s, 80s, and 90s that converted to Catholicism. But obviously those things were only brief because obviously I was still raised Adventist, but at the same time I had to keep my studies of Catholicism, in the back as not to cause any more scandals in the family.
Okay. So you began to study, and which were the things which may move you deep?
Sorry.
Which were these things that move you more interiorly, to think more deeply about Catholicism?
Yeah, sure. Two main things drew me towards Catholicism. I can definitely say that there were definitely signs from a very young age that kind of made me fall in love with Catholicism a lot more. The first was the Blessed Virgin Mary. As I mentioned before, I saw in wherever I go, wherever I went, or briefly, I would see paintings or images of Mary. And even reading scripture, I always felt that Mary had to be someone more than just a mother of Jesus. And over time, over the years, when I was studying Marian doctrines and dogmas, mind you, this was actually something gradual, nothing that I immediately accepted overnight, but I wasn't hostile. I was slowly falling in love with the Virgin Mary in the sense that I was beginning to see her more clearer in a more profound way than what I was told and what Protestants are usually told about the Virgin Mary. The more I saw her as the Mother of God, the more I saw her as the instrument of our salvation, the more I saw her as someone that I needed in my life, that I couldn't just immediately dismiss her as just another woman. And then, funny story, I wanted to get off topic, but when I was studying Catholicism, particularly stuff about Mary, I originally thought growing up that I thought that the title Co-Redemptrix was actually the fifth Marian dogma of the church, but it wasn't until 12 years later when I realized that it wasn't the fifth Marian dogma. I was so upset. I was like, why is it not a dogma? If it made sense to me and other people understand, like it makes sense, then why is it a dogma? But obviously now with my knowledge that I have now, I understand that the reason why it's not a dogma, because even though it is a belief that has been around for a very long time, it's a doctrine, if you will, that has not been infallibly defined yet by any pope, which I'm hoping one day that it will be. And I know that will infuriate so many Protestants if that happens, if that officially happens. The second doctrine or dogma that drew me closer to Catholicism was the papacy. I know you, Dom, Andrew Bartel, and Michael Lofton were talking about the papacy briefly, but the papacy, if there's one word to describe myself, I am a quote-unquote hyper-papalist, if you would. I love the papacy because not only that the papacy is historically true, but it makes sense that Christ instituted a hierarchical society, and since Christ instituted not only the sacraments but also instituted his kingdom, which is now the new covenant kingdom, which is the Catholic Church, which is a replication and the final copy, if you would, of the Davidic kingdom of the Old Testament. And when I was studying the parallels of the papacy and the Davidic kingdom, and when I was studying more about Catholic dogmas and doctrines of papal infallibility and the papacy overall, I instantly, like, I became a subject to the Roman pontiff, even though I wasn't a baptized Roman Catholic. And one of my favorite quotes, and it's still one of my favorite quotes of a pope, dogmatically, was the dogmatic pronouncement of Pope Boniface VIII, which has which serves me as a constant reminder that the papacy is truly needed. And for those of you who do not know the dogmatic definition of Boniface VIII, he basically, and I quote, he said, "We declare, proclaim, and define that it is absolutely necessary for salvation to be subject to the Roman pontiff."
Awesome. I
That,
love that.
that, as you know, all Catholic dogmas, everything in our Catholic faith is centered around three main things: the Eucharist, Mary, and the papacy. If you remove any of these pillars or try to distort it or try to change things up because you personally do not like it, like we see in various other groups recently in the past few years and for quite some time, trying to damage the name of the papacy by adopting positions and certain ideals that are not in conformity with what the Catholic Church has taught, then you destroy and you corrupt the doctrine, if you would, of the papacy. It will not make sense. So me seeing the anti-Catholic fear of the papacy in America, especially my denomination and through other denominations, that fear turned into love for the papacy. And I said this before on numerous occasions, but if I were to go back in time, or even at any particular moment of history, if I were to meet any particular pope, I will just get down on my knees and kiss his feet and kiss his ring as a sign of my subjection and my obedience and my devotion to him and the office.
Mm.
Because as a Roman, and because that is something that obviously caused so much fear and animosity of many Protestants through over the years, was the hatred of the papacy, the idea of having one man having supreme authority over all of humanity in matters of faith and morals and discipline. That may make people uncomfortable, but to me, especially growing up as a Protestant, when I was discovering the inconsistencies of Adventism and Protestantism, the more I really wanted to become subject and obedient to the vicar of Christ.
Okay, and which were you talk now about the Catholic doctrines which you began to be attracted to? It would be interesting if you could tell us which were the doctrines with the Protestant doctrines which you found more inconsistent, that actually led you more easily to Catholicism.
Yes, that's a good question. Obviously, a lot of the a lot of the Catholic beliefs, such as the real presence, and various other basic dogmas of our faith, I immediately accepted them. Over time, I didn't really struggle with the Eucharist because to me it kind of made sense. Because one of the things I realized in Protestantism is, like, if you take this particular verse to be literal, but you do not take the words of Jesus Christ in John 6 or the words of St. Paul to be literal, then what gives you the right to say that this is, metaphorically speaking, what Jesus Christ said,
Mm.
The same thing, and I even asked myself this: if you literally believe that Jesus Christ walked on water, multiplied bread and fish to feed thousands, to feed the thousands, and if you believe that he rose people from the dead, and if you believe he turned water into wine, and he did all sorts of miracles, why is it that you do not believe in the real presence?
Right.
Because the Jews would not have walked away. If one of the things I realized is that the Jews knew what Jesus Christ was saying in John 6. If Jesus Christ, and I realized that if Jesus Christ was only speaking metaphorically in that particular instance, then his reputation and competence as a teacher would immediately been called into question. The reason why the Jews left our Lord Jesus Christ was because they knew exactly what he was talking about. But the vast majority of them did not want to accept it, except for the very few apostles and a few followers that were there after our Lord said those words. Another inconsistency, a big inconsistency that I've noticed from Adventism and Catholicism, but also Adventism and other Protestant denominations, was the idea of the Sabbath. As I mentioned before, one of the main key differences of Adventism as opposed to all Protestant denominations and the Catholic and Orthodox churches is that the Adventist Church does not worship on Sunday, they worship on Saturday. That obviously was something that took me quite a while for me to research and study, but obviously that did go in line with my studies of papal infallibility and the doctrine of the papacy and establishment of the Catholic Church. But one of the things I realized was an inconsistency that I'm still surprised to this day that even Adventists are still trying to swing around and just trying to dodge. The fact is that they argue that for the first few hundred years of the church, all the early Christians worshipped on Saturday, which obviously you and I know through the historical facts and the evidence that we have and through documentation, we know that the early church did not worship on Saturday. You may have had some individual groups that were probably worshiping on Saturday, but the collective Christian church, the early church, was not. As you know, they've always referred to Sunday as the day of the Lord, or the Lord's Day. Even in Revelation chapter 1, John was referencing when he received the visions at the island of Patmos. He said that he received it on the Lord's Day. Now, if he was receiving it on Saturday or the Sabbath, he would have specifically mentioned the Lord. He should have specifically mentioned Sabbath, but he didn't. That was a red flag for me. Another red flag was Martin Luther. And I made this statement quite a while ago, but I will say this again for your audience and for you especially, is that the Adventist Church cannot honor or respect or praise Martin Luther while at the same time say that Saturday is the Sabbath and every other denomination is wrong. You see where I'm getting at? Because Luther never once, the majority of Protestants view Luther as a prophet or like a savior or like a true hero of true Christianity, in air quotes. But as you know, he wasn't. And one of the things that I noticed was that obviously Martin Luther never held the Sabbath, but he was supposedly inspired by God. But centuries along the way, then comes Ellen White that received a vision that says that Sunday is not the day of rest, it's actually still Saturday. But what really didn't make any sense to me is that if Saturday is a true day of worship, and if you believe God inspired Martin Luther, then why didn't God tell Martin Luther or inspired Martin Luther to keep the seventh day as the day of rest? Why didn't he and all the other quote unquote reformers didn't do that? That was something that never really made sense to me. I knew it was off, but after research and obviously realizing that Protestantism as a whole is based upon subjective interpretation of scripture and all that stuff, and I realized that particular moment and that particular doctrine of Adventism on the Sabbath, as well as other things that I discovered, I realized that the Sabbath issue was something that I couldn't continue to accept due to the fact that God cannot tell one person one thing and tell another person another thing that completely contradicts what the first person was told about, you know?
Mm. Okay. And which was the moment when you said, you know, now I'm Catholic, or it was it a long process?
Well, yes, it was a
Was
long
there
process. I'm sorry?
was there a, was there a moment, you know,
Hmm.
definite moment when you said, okay, now I will, you know, make this formal and public, you know,
Yes,
I'm Catholic, you know.
yes. There were a lot of moments in me in my life that I said I wanted to be Catholic, like officially wanted to be. It was my sophomore year of high school when I realized officially that Adventism cannot be true at all. Because right after I was studying, I can't remember what, I believe I was studying more about the Virgin Mary in detail and other Catholic doctrines, but I think it was the Virgin Mary. Like I was watching a video, a very in-depth video about the Virgin Mary, and then something like hit me. Like I felt like I was stabbed in the heart. It's kind of like a moment that happens to a lot of to most Protestant converts, if not all of them, where they have like this one moment in their life where they realize that Protestantism or what they used to believe does not make sense anymore. It does not align with Scripture. It does not align with history. And it was me watching that video of the Virgin Mary. I can't remember which one it was, but it was a very good, in-depth one that explained the typology, the symbolism, all that stuff, the Marian doctrines in more detail than I ever knew prior. That I instantly like realized like I can't be an Adventist anymore. I have to be Catholic. Um, but obviously, during over the years, um, people in my church and especially my family knew about my fascinations and my interest towards Catholicism, and I was met with a lot of negativity. And it wasn't really good because it did damage, even to this day, like the reputation and the friendship and the amnesty I had with these people. I mean, I understand that they were doing this through no fault of their own, but at the same time, if I did the research myself, as well as many Protestant converts out there, then why can't you? I couldn't just sit back and continue to listen to all the anti Catholic statements and beliefs that back then, when I had the aha moment, I realized I couldn't keep accepting them. They don't make sense.
And you had to baptize, or Adventism has any valid sacrament?
Uh, ye- yeah, the sacrament of baptism obviously it's valid,
Mm.
as according to what the church has taught with regards to Protestant baptisms, but it's a tricky situation. I was conditionally baptized when I was received into the Catholic Church because, as well as many other Protestant converts, get conditionally baptized, mainly because, in my particular instance, because the Adventist belief of the Trinity, while it is very similar to the common belief of the Trinity, there were some things that were really off as opposed to the common norm and the common belief of the Trinity. And I, for a long time, doubted my baptism, and even even like before the changes and the customs that came after the Second Vatican Council, it was already a custom for all Protestant converts to be conditionally baptized,
Mm.
and um, depending on the denomination. And even during the time of Pope Pius XII, he urged and urged that Protestant converts should be conditionally baptized, because even during his time, the time of Pius XII, there were already so many denominations out there that believe in different ideas of the Trinity, which obviously therefore could or already have invalidated their baptism. And in my particular case, I did not want to take any chances when I was received into the church, which I'll get into more detail later. But I was conditionally baptized just to be on the safe side.
Okay. Was there any important person or saint which in your conversion process?
Many. I would definitely say the biggest individual in my life that was influential in my conversion was obviously the Blessed Virgin Mary. I do give her credit for my conversion to Catholicism because I argue that without her and her ways of interceding for me and showing me the signs, my conversion or my understanding of Catholicism would be completely different than it is today. I would definitely would like to give credit to a lot of the Catholic friends that I did have growing up from various spectrums of Catholicism, if you would, which, there's really no such thing as a spectrum in Catholicism. But I do give credit to a lot of the Catholics that I was friends with growing up and was hanging out with even when I was at my Adventist university. A lot of my people I used to be friends with were, some of them were sedevacantists, some of them were supporters of the Society of St. Pius X, and others were traditionalists and all that, as well as, non-traditionalist Catholics that were, conservative. I am grateful for them for helping me along the way and everything, and I'm grateful. But obviously, when it comes to various other groups and everything, obviously, during the time, I knew that a lot of the people that I used to be friends with that were sedevacantists and were supporters of the Society of St. Pius X were trying to convince me to adopt their position, especially the Society of St. Pius X. But then, not to make a whole rambling on the Society of St. Pius X, but I realized that even in my studies of the papacy and going in line with what the church has taught, I realized that the recognize and resist position is something that is not compatible with what the Catholic Church has taught. It's impossible, and you distort the papacy and you make it almost meaningless.
Yeah.
Now, with sedevacantism, well, I do respect sedevacantists a lot more than the Society of St. Pius X, mainly because even though I disagree with sedevacantism, their position is more consistent than recognize and resist. But obviously, the thing that made me not sedevacantist was the idea of the visible church, the visible hierarchy, and how that it is a dogma of the church that from Pentecost Sunday until the end of time, there needs to exist a perpetual succession of popes and bishops, not just in any kind of jurisdiction, but also bishops of ordinary jurisdiction. It's not an opinion, it's not an axiom or a thesis, but it's a dogma of faith that we have to believe. And yes, sedevacantists have tried to work their way around this by adopting various ideas or positions like the material formal thesis, Gassis Shakum, all that stuff, but still, sedevacantism, while it's tempting as well as recognize and resist, still did not resonate within me because of my years of study of Catholicism. And even before I officially converted to Catholicism, I realized that I couldn't align myself with these groups.
I guess when you found that the true church was the Catholic Church, you encountered these groups like the Sedevacantists, the SSPX. You told us briefly why you didn't align with them. I guess you also found another stream of thinking, the more progressive one. So
Yes.
how did you solve that problem as well? Because when you find the Catholic Church, it happened to me too. You know, I wasn't a practicing Catholic, and then I found that the true church was a Catholic church. I became Catholic, and then I had to solve the problem of, okay, so inside the church, who has the right position? So how did you solve that issue?
With the liberal Catholics, I would like to say, if it weren't for my studies of Catholicism growing up and my years of dedication and learning about everything I knew about Catholicism, I would have ended up as a liberal.
Mm,
Mainly because you have to understand that the mind of a convert or someone who is interested in Catholicism is like a sponge. Like they will absorb almost everything that they can find related to Catholicism. And if they believe that is Catholicism, then they will accept it. But thankfully, because of my like I mentioned, my studies of Catholicism, I realized that um, that the liberals of the church, if you would, they were very very crazy. The ones I've interacted, not all of them, but the ones that I personally have interacted with, um, I'm not questioning the sincerity of these people. I'm sure that they probably meant well, but if it's difficult for me to talk because I was very scandalized by the liberals that I met on my journey to Catholicism. Um, I was first, I mean, before I went to RCIA, I wanted to go to a catechism class, and this was back in 2015 when I was sent to the Adventist university. Um, I was sent to the Adventist university at the time, and during the time I wanted to become Catholic. And so I went to the nearest Catholic church that was near my university. And unbeknownst to me, I didn't realize that it was a very liberal parish. You know, I went to their catechism classes, and when I was there, it felt very weird because I was slowly starting to realize that they were liberal because the way that they were presenting the Catholic faith in a very Protestant manner. And to make a long story short, I was there for some time and I didn't hear anything about the Virgin Mary. I didn't hear anything about the saints. I didn't hear about the sacraments except maybe baptism or the Eucharist. It was just something, just Jesus, Jesus, Jesus. That's something that I've heard a lot in Protestant circles. I went to a retreat. I was invited, and while the retreat was good, it was a nightmare because I experienced firsthand my very first liturgical abuse, and that's I still get chills and nightmares thinking about it because I was scandalized because they had a lot of they had a lot of the mass that they had at the retreat. Obviously, they had a lot of clapping and dancing, guitar. They they didn't have like the host. They actually baked the bread and they used it as the as the Eucharist. And there was a lot of, like I said, dancing and singing and all that stuff nonstop. And then any leftover uh, hosts, if you would, or the actual thing that they used for the consecration, they put it at a table, um, at like a table at the end table, just out in the open for people to just grab and eat. And I was like, no, like this is this is bad. And then I was asking the catechist and the deacon and seminarian that was there, that were one of the coordinators of the retreat. And it was like, this isn't what I thought Catholicism was of all my years of study. And I think it was the seminarian that told me, well, catechism, we're not really supposed to talk about, all the things about the Catholic Church. Our main thing is just to talk about Jesus and how we're supposed to have a relationship with them.
Mm.
And I asked them, what about me? I'm interested in converting to Catholicism. If you think those things don't matter, and if aren't, what about me? Shouldn't I not convert then? And one of the people told me, well, that's up to your personal decision. Jesus will still love you regardless of what denomination you belong to, and he's happy where you are and stuff. And a lot of other stuff happened after the retreat, and I was scandalized. I left, and I never came back at all. Mind you, I was studying I went to the Adventist University in Tacoma Park, Maryland, and for most people that are watching this will know that Maryland is a very liberal state, and obviously, if a liberal state will come very liberal churches, and unfortunately, many Catholic churches in the state of Maryland, even though Maryland has historically been a safe haven for Catholicism, it hasn't been a safe haven for a very long time for the liberalism and all the social and ethical destructions that we've been witnessing over the past decades. So I had various other encounters with liberal Catholics, but that particular moment was like a major one that I still cannot forget.
Mm. Okay, so we are getting to an hour. Maybe another
Like
question.
I said, I have time.
I think we could talk, for an hour more, about this.
Okay.
There's so many things you could tell us. One question I wanted to ask you, maybe two, just to wrap up. The first one would be if the saints of the 20th century or of this century, let's say, Saint Pio Pietrelcina, Saint John Paul II, Saint Mother Teresa, and the saints of beginnings of 20th century, were they helpful for you?
Yeah, you mean were they an inspiration to me growing up?
Yeah. I asked this because they helped me a lot personally, and I wanted
Yeah.
to know if you experienced something similar.
Particularly Mother Teresa, Padre Pio, John Paul II especially. Particularly those three, because particularly actually especially Mother Teresa and John Paul II, because but most especially John Paul II, because growing up Adventist, we were told for a long time, that the Pope is the Antichrist and all that stuff, which is a common belief amongst many Protestant denominations, a historical belief. But in the case of John Paul II, as many of you, as probably you know as well, there were a lot of conspiracies and a lot of things against John Paul II. Considering that he was one of the longest reigning popes, but also a lot of during the 80s and the 90s, there were a lot of conspiracy theories about him that were made up by the Protestants and stuff and Protestants, and a lot of other things. And a lot of people, even during the time of John Paul II, literally thought that JP2 was the Antichrist, because as you know, John Paul II was the first pope that literally traveled all over the world and evangelized and did so much that no other pope in history had done. And I will argue since the time of the early church, because even prior to Vatican II, very few popes have visited various other nations. But John Paul II, as you know, was a historical pope because of all the things that he did, especially since he was the most traveled pope. And any time that John Paul II would travel, you would hear all the Protestants, getting scared and all that stuff. When you have, John Paul II meeting with world leaders, people were scared because they thought it was the end of the world and stuff like that. But
Mm.
not just with John Paul II, but the same thing with Benedict XVI and currently our Holy Father Pope Francis. All the interactions and all the things that they've done, especially when I was growing up a Seventh-day Adventist, obviously I was told that obviously he's the Antichrist, that no matter how much good that they do outside, that he is still the embodiment of evil, and the Catholic Church is the whore of Babylon. But as I mentioned to you a while ago, me studying the papacy, regardless of all the nonsensical conspiracy theories and all the stuff that I've heard from all Protestant circles, not just in Adventism, but everywhere, like, to me, that didn't matter. If the church was right about the papacy, it has to be right about everything else.
Mm. Okay, and what would you recommend to someone who maybe is watching us or will be watching us and is thinking about Catholicism? Maybe someone who is Protestant or someone who is another religion or atheist, for example.
I would say definitely prayer. I have a saying that I've been using for a very long time, and that's, without prayer, you go nowhere. One of the things that has helped me over the years in my journey to Catholicism was prayer, because without the grace of God, I could not have been, where I am today. So having, not just praying to God, but also praying to the saints and praying to Mary, having them, viewing them as not just, random individuals that I thought they meant nothing to me growing up, but I knew that they were part of a larger family because they are part of the Church Triumphant. They're part of the Catholic Church. They weren't dead individuals in the sense that they're not, that they're in the grave not doing anything, but while their bodies may be dead, their souls are in heaven, except of course our Blessed Mother, who was assumed body and soul into heaven. So prayer is also a very important thing that I would recommend as like the first thing that you should do. Another thing that I would recommend, and I cannot stress this enough, go to official Catholic sources.
Mm.
Any source or any information that has been approved by the Catholic Church or by the local bishop. Don't go to, or you can watch various content creators on social media and various platforms that have accreditation, that have degrees, or have actual experience in the field of apologetics and have, this kind of education in those areas. Do not go watch individuals. While they may present some truth, they do not have any kind of accreditation or anything to tell you that you must believe this or this is what the Catholic Church teaches. Even though we all have a duty to evangelize, it's one thing to evangelize the Catholic faith, but it's another thing to insert various positions or ideas that are not in conformity with what the Catholic Church teaches, or insert your own opinions that will have a direct influence on the way you view Catholicism. Of course, I'm not going to mention any names. I think you know which individuals I'm talking about, especially they're prevalent. And some people will say that I'm a hypocrite because if I say that people who do not have degrees in theology or canon law can't preach the Catholic faith, then neither can I. Well, again, the difference is that I'm not saying that even though I do apologetics and social media, The thing that makes me different is that, like various others, is not to show off, but the difference is that I'm not inserting my own opinions or proposing beliefs that are not in conformity with what the Catholic Church teaches. I'm not someone that will continue to get in with the whole scandals or dramas or even quote unquote supposed scandals and dramas that are happening in Rome. Because to me, that's not really evangelizing. You're just, when you are presenting more constant scandals over and over and over again to non-Catholics, what you're basically doing is reinforcing the negative stigma and the false misconceptions that they have about the Catholic Church. And that's not going to help them at all. It may help a few people, but on the larger spectrum, on a larger scope, it's not going to help anyone at all.
And the final question, Clyde, what would you recommend to someone who is now prepared to become a Catholic and finds a mess inside the church? The German bishops, all the liberalism, and then the other side of the coin, the traditionalism, sedevacantism, the SSPX, all these things. What would you recommend to them?
I would, obviously, the first thing is that I will remind them is that Christ founded a divine institution, the perfect society, which is the Catholic Church. But within the society, there exist people that are not perfect. Even though the Catholic Church is the divine institution, the people that run the church and the people that belong to the church are still sinners. In every walk of life, in every society, you're going to have bad people. That's a given. No matter how much scandal or no matter how much negativity you hear from various people about the Catholic Church, whether they may be non-Catholic or especially Catholic, you do not let those things disturb your peace, because oftentimes these people would present the bad things or quote unquote bad things that are happening in an angle or they present it in a way that will fit a particular agenda, and that is very dangerous. One of the things that when I officially converted to Catholicism from Adventism back in 2019 officially, was when I was officially received to the church. I literally said as a prayer to Our Lady the very day I was received to the church was, "Mother, I'm home." I knew that the church is my home, that while it is a holy house, the individuals in themselves, while there could be those that are holy, they're still sinners, and people will make mistakes. People will do a lot of bad things in the end. And I have to constantly remind myself, and no matter how tempting it is for a lot of Catholics, especially Catholics in these days, to completely adopt various positions or adopt particular attitudes that are not becoming of a Catholic, you have to, as a dogma of faith, not just in the church law, but also divine law, you must remain faithful to Rome. You have to stay faithful to Rome. You must be obedient to Rome. You must stay in communion with Rome. You have to pledge yourself because of your baptismal vows and because of your membership of the church. You are subject to the church and the hierarchy of the church. You can't just say, "Oh, because bad people in the hierarchy exist, that means I can recognize them, but I can also disobey them at the same time and just completely ignore what they have to say unless it's to my favor." But that's not Catholic teaching. That's a very Protestant mindset. You may disagree with some of the actions of the particular people in mind, or particular leaders in the church, but that doesn't give you the right to outright disobey them or completely ignore their existence. The Catholic Church is a monarchical, hierarchical society. We're not a democracy. If you want that kind of freedom to express yourselves in such a way that to the things that I mentioned prior, then you're no better than a Protestant, in my eyes. Because especially nowadays in the society that we're living in, it's a post-Reformation, post-French Revolution, post-modernized society in which the concepts of hierarchy, monarchy, obedience, all this stuff is obviously called into question. The whole power to the people, all that stuff has infected the minds of the vast majority of the Earth's population. And seeing how many Catholics out there are adopting these principles, even though they don't say it by name, whether they know it or not, they have adopted a lot of the principles of Protestantism, modernism, and Americanism, all that stuff, into their rejection of lawful and legitimate authority. I know as a Catholic, and by studying Catholic teaching, that is not going in line with what Jesus Christ taught and what the church has taught for 2,000 years. As I mentioned before, bad people will always exist, that's a given, but that doesn't give you the right to resist them in the sense that you completely disobey them and ignore them, and practically will not listen to them unless that you find something that they say that it's for your own benefit and interests. That's not Catholic teaching.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much for coming. It has been great to have you listen to your story. As I said, we could speak about this for a long time. So I hope you can keep on sharing your story so that many souls will profit of it. Tell us where people can find more about you.
Yes. As I mentioned previously, if you want to find me, I am mostly on Instagram. My handle is Latin Catholicism. That is that's my main active social media account, which I'm more active on. I'm also active on various other platforms, but in my main bio on my social media page, Latin Catholicism, like you will see all the other pages that I run and that I manage. But if you want to interact with me and stuff, you're more than happy to follow me there at your leisure.
Excellent. So thank you very much, Clyde.
You're welcome. Thank you, Ezekiel, for the invitation.
See you.
Thank you.